was 3:15 a.m. I woke up to a terrifying screech from upstairs. It felt like the neighbors upstairs had decided to have a huge showdown before bed. And this was 4 hours before work on a Monday. I must say, they were quite a family. A perpetually drunk jerk whose smell of sweat and fumes could be smelled from 100 meters away. His overweight wife always causing scenes by smashing dishes and throwing stinking things out the window. And the triumph of their life together. A 20-year-old son, Ivan, with Down syndrome. His favorite pastime was running around the building pressing doorbells in every apartment, which he apparently got immense pleasure from. Getting out of bed and muttering something obscene and disgruntled, I headed to the kitchen. I turned on the light, lit a cigarette, drank a glass of water, and looked out the window. It was a warm, starry summer night, dark and empty. Of course, it was 3 o'clock, for fuck's sake. It was interesting, but other than the squeal that had woken me, I heard no sign of activity. So I tossed my cigarette butt out the window and went to my bed to burrow under the covers and continue my wonderful, sweet dreams, completely unrelated to the dreary Monday. Before I could even close my eyes, I jumped out of bed from a crash above, as if something very heavy had fallen. I thought the ceiling was going to collapse. Even the whitewash fell a little onto my bed. Holy shit, I thought, as I hurriedly pulled on my jeans. I was in a terrible mood. I wanted to sleep, but no. I had to go see the alcoholic neighbors and find out what had happened. Opening the front door, I discovered there was no light in the entryway, and considering it was night outside, I couldn't see a thing. The bulb must have burned out again. Taking a flashlight from the nightstand, I set out to face my nighttime adventures. I went upstairs and approached the ill-fated family's peeling wooden door. The peephole revealed a light on in the hallway of their apartment. After a few seconds of hesitation, I rang the doorbell. There was no response. I rang again. Nothing. Oh, screw it, I said quietly, and was just about to turn around to leave when I noticed the dim light coming from the peephole had disappeared. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, looking straight at me. Finally, I thought, and was about to see the apartment owner, barely able to stand, trying to explain what had happened. But no one responded. I stood in the dark entryway, flashlight in hand, aware that someone was watching me from the other side of the door. I assessed the situation from a distance and felt uneasy. Deciding the best option was to return to my apartment, I turned and headed for the stairs, shining my flashlight. The feeling of someone watching me from behind wouldn't leave me. I wanted to run, but I restrained myself, calming myself with the thought that there had been a million similar situations with this dysfunctional family. And now, a drunken alcoholic stood at the door, unable to do anything but stand and hold on, just to keep from falling. As I stepped onto the stairs, something happened that sent shivers down my spine. The door I'd just been standing next to creaked open slightly. I stopped, frozen, and felt my heart beat twice as fast. Summoning my willpower, I turned and shone my flashlight toward the door. It was ajar. Anyone alive I asked in a shaky, playful voice. Of course, there was no response. After standing like that for a minute, I finally decided there was nothing to gain here and that the best course of action would be to lock myself in my apartment, crawl under the covers, and sleep soundly. I quickly went downstairs, unlocked the front door, locked it, went into my room, and lay down on the bed. I calmed down, lay down, and after reflecting on the situation, I even found it a little funny. A grown man, 27 years old after all, was afraid of the dark and the inappropriate behavior of his alcoholic neighbors. As I pondered this, I began to drift off to sleep when suddenly the doorbell rang. All my thoughts about the humor of the situation vanished in the time it took to ring the doorbell twice. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. Their son, who has a mental retardation, was standing across from my apartment. One hand was reaching for the doorbell, and with the other, he was actively picking his nose. I was even glad to see him. It would have been far worse to find no one in the building at all. Then the situation would have been reminiscent of a classic 90s horror film. Another ringing interrupted my thoughts of what ifs and what ifs. And, once again reassured of his presence, I turned on the light and opened the front door. Well, what's wrong? I asked, walking out onto the landing to join him. Vanya, at that very moment, was busy removing a rather large green substance from his nose, which he placed in his mouth with a blissful expression and swallowed with a smacking sound. I almost threw up, but oddly enough, my gag reflex caught his attention. Without waiting for him to react, I took Vanya by the sleeve and, locking my door, led him toward his apartment. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Unfortunately, I hadn't been smart enough to bring a flashlight. As he trudged up the stairs after me, he uttered incoherent words and unintelligible grunts. It was clear he didn't want to go home, though he wasn't resisting too much. We finally reached the apartment itself, the front door wide open, but due to the lack of light in both the apartment and the entryway, it was impossible to see anything. We both stopped 2 meters from the apartment. Vanya's heavy breathing broke the silence. At that moment, a feeling of unease and worry washed over me again. This damned apartment seemed to exude terror. The sensation of someone watching me from the darkness was driving me crazy. I looked at Vanya. The outline of his face suggested he was staring into the darkness of the doorway. "Dad," he said. His voice echoed through the entryway, and then silence. I peered with all my might, but saw no one. "Well, Vanya, go home," I said quietly, almost in a whisper, and nudged him forward, while I began to move in the opposite direction toward the stairs. I felt ashamed for being scared and, on top of that, sending a sick guy on a sort of reconnaissance mission. But I couldn't muster the nerve to act otherwise. The distance between me and Vanya grew. He stood and stared ahead, and I backed away. Against the darkness, I saw his receding silhouette. Suddenly, Vanya turned around and, in a satisfied voice, very loudly and clearly uttered a phrase I absolutely didn't want to hear. "Daddy ate Mommy," he said, and burst into a loud, imbecilic laugh. I couldn't believe my ears. The mere fact that he'd uttered a phrase that made any sense was rare enough. And then, in such a situation, to say such a thing, my heart nearly stopped. A stunned expression crossed my face, and I stopped, searching for a rational explanation. "What?" I muttered, my voice not quite my own, and continued walking slowly, backing toward the stairs. But all I got in response was he, and some incomprehensible muttering. Approaching the first step, I nearly fell, and began to feel for the next one with my foot, keeping my eyes on the now barely discernible silhouette, when suddenly, with a sharp, brief scuffling sound, it disappeared. Ivan's usual heavy breathing also disappeared. My nerves simply exploded. Turning around in a flash, I covered the distance to the stairwell in a single leap, grabbing the railing with one hand to avoid slamming into the wall. I twisted my ankle, but given the overall situation, it wasn't particularly inconvenient. I was wearing slippers, by the way. In the time between my landing and my continued movement, I heard footsteps coming from their apartment. This gave me a strong incentive to keep going and to quickly descend to my floor. I wasn't mentally replaying any possible scenarios of what was happening there. I had no thoughts at all, except one: to get to my apartment, my refuge, as quickly as possible. Running to the door, I frantically, in a great hurry, began to pull a set of keys from my pocket. Since it was dark, I had to find the right one, by touch. The garage, the storage room, the dacha. I cursed myself for carrying all of this around with me in one big bundle. Footsteps were getting closer and were already clearly audible on my floor. Someone had already come down and was heading my way. I wanted to cry. I wanted the light to come on so I could see that nothing terrible was happening. I wanted to wake up and realize that everything that was happening was just a bad dream. "Here it is," I screamed out loud, and with shaking hands, I slid the key into the lock. Turning it counterclockwise, I took a step back, opened the door, and flew through the threshold. I was safe. All that was left was to close the front door, and that was it. Turning to face her, I quickly reached for the handle, grabbed it, and was about to pull it toward me, but a human silhouette was a third of a meter away. I felt the movement of air caused by his breath immediately and almost threw up. I have never smelled such a disgusting stench in my life. The man standing across from me was motionless. Taking a substantial step back, I began to fumble for the light switch on the wall. The figure also took a step forward, stepping over the threshold. I was so absorbed in the situation that even fear momentarily left me, but it was replaced by a panicked, natural terror that nearly caused me to lose consciousness. Because I finally found the switch and turned on the light. His hair was either half lost or half torn. His skin was an unnaturally pale color, with blue veins showing through. His eyes were completely black, without whites or irises. From his lower jaw to the shoes of my alcoholic neighbor, everything was covered in blood. His open mouth, with blood sparsely dripping onto the floor, revealed bloody teeth, clearly not all of which he had. Madness was evident on his face. I looked down and noticed that he was holding his wife's fat, chewed-off hand. We stood there, staring at each other for about 5 seconds, when suddenly a growl, reminiscent of a huge bulldog, erupted from his mouth. I instantly came to my senses, and a distinct "run" rang in my head. I dashed into my room, slammed the door, and grabbed the doorknob with my hands. With a furious roar, my neighbor, if you can call him that, although a monster would be more appropriate, rushed after me. Running to the door, contrary to my expectations, he didn't try to open it by tugging at the handle. He scratched at it with his nails, banged his head, and tried to bite it with his teeth, like a dog. And I sat, pressed against the door, holding the handle, thinking about my cell phone lying in my jacket in the hallway, and that if I let go of the door to reach and turn on the light, this monster would surely enter my room and devour me the same way he devoured his wife and child. Losing track of time, listening to my neighbor scratching, growling, gnawing, and pounding on the door, I sat like that until the morning. When it began to get light, I heard the door of my neighbor on my floor open. She was a lonely elderly woman. I got up from the floor and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Run!" The neighbor stopped making noise for a while. Then I heard my neighbor scream, which lasted a couple of seconds and then died down. Everything was as if in a delirium. How long I sat like that, I have no idea. I only know that after dealing with my neighbor, the monster disappeared somewhere. Sometime later, the police opened the door. Then there was an investigation, now closed, in which I was the prime suspect, but due to a lack of evidence, I remain at large. My neighbor was found with her throat slit in a pool of her own blood. In the apartment above, the wife of an alcoholic neighbor was found dismembered and scattered throughout the apartment. His son's body lay in the hallway, and his head, with a stupid grin on his face, was in the entryway outside the apartment. The neighbor himself was never found, but I'm sure he's wandering somewhere in the darkness of the night, like a stray dog. And since there's no body, that means he's still alive, and that means he's eating. And we already know his favorite dish.